They told me retirement would be the quiet part of life, that after decades of long deployments, early wake-ups, and decisions with lives hanging in the balance, I'd finally get to breathe. Sit on the porch, watch the seasons change, maybe even learn how to bake sourdough, if I could ever figure out yeast. And for the first 2 years after I moved into the house up on Ridgeview Hills, it almost felt like that might be true. The house wasn't fancy. It was modest 2-story cedar shingles tucked into the slope of a hill that overlooked the rest of the neighborhood like a watchtower. Fitting, I suppose, for an old Army operations officer who hadn't yet figured out how to stop standing guard. There was a stone patio out back and a steep incline behind the fence carpeted in dry grass and sagebrush. To the east, the slope dropped off, sharply leading to a narrow access road and a thin strip of HOA-managed land, the kind that looked like a greenbelt on paper, but was mostly just thorns and runoff channels. I liked that part. It meant fewer people to bother me. When I bought the place, the seller was eager, too eager. I should have read between the lines, but I was tired and the price was good. I didn't realize then how much of that so-called greenbelt actually depended on the integrity of my slope. My retaining wall, my old drainage channels, my foundation. They were holding back more than just soil. The HOA was called Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association, even though we were a solid 40-minute drive from any lake. I didn't pay much attention to them at first. I paid my dues, kept my trash cans out of sight, mowed regularly, and mindfully ignored the passive-aggressive newsletters about mailbox uniformity and seasonal flags. I didn't want trouble, and I sure as hell didn't want involvement. Then came Karen Jennings. If I had a nickel for every time someone warned me about HOA Karens, I'd have a backyard pizza oven by now. But I didn't expect her. Not in real life. Karen Jennings was the president of the HOA board recently elected after what the neighborhood gossip group called the Lawn Flamingo scandal of 2020. She wore pastel sweaters and pearls like armor and spoke with the cold efficiency of a bureaucrat who never heard the word no in her life. She moved with the air of a woman who believed rules existed for other people to follow and for her to enforce. I first met her the week after she moved 3 houses down during one of her routine property walkthroughs. She stopped by my gate clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched perfectly on her nose. She didn't introduce herself. She pointed at a flower bed I hadn't weeded and then to a decorative flag hanging from my mailbox. This kind of informal decor isn't permitted under Ridgeview standardization guidelines, she said flatly. I laughed. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. A week later, I got a warning notice. 2 days after that, a fine. That was the beginning. Over the next few months, Karen Jennings made it her personal mission to elevate Ridgeview Hills, which apparently meant disrupting everything that made it livable. She initiated what she called the Beautification Initiative, which included new flower beds in shared zones, expanded walking paths, and even a proposed mini dog park. The board, newly stacked with her yes men, approved everything. Fast. At first, I stayed out of it. HOA overreach wasn't new to me. I'd been stationed on enough bases to know how tiny people could grow dangerous when handed a clipboard and a title. But what I didn't realize was how literally close she was getting. One morning in early April, I was sitting on the back patio, coffee in hand, listening to the birds and wondering whether I should finally replace the fence posts at the bottom of the hill. That's when I heard the beeping. Not the soft beep of a car backing out. The harsh rhythmic shriek of heavy machinery. I stood up, squinting down the slope, and saw a backhoe. A full-sized yellow backhoe grinding its teeth into the dirt near the base of my property line halfway down the hillside. Men in reflective vests were marking the ground with spray paint. Stakes had been driven. A portable toilet had already been dropped next to a contractor trailer. I walked down in disbelief. No one looked at me. No one offered an explanation. Finally, I stopped a young guy in a hard hat who was unloading survey equipment. "What are you doing?" I asked. He shrugged. "Drainage trench. HOA ordered it." Said the slope was eroding. My slope. He hesitated. They said it was shared runoff. It wasn't. I had the deed. I had the survey. And I knew every inch of that hill because I'd been maintaining it for 2 years, including the drainage pipe I'd rerouted after the first hard rain. I called the HOA office. No answer. I sent an email. Auto response. So I did what any reasonable man would do. I walked back up, grabbed my folder of property documents, and drove straight to the community center. The HOA office was locked. Karen wasn't there. That night, I called a lawyer I knew from my old unit. She now worked in property rights. She told me what I already suspected: this was more than a miscommunication. This was a violation. She advised me to document everything. The next day, I did just that. I walked the hillside with a camera, recorded the equipment, the trench lines, even the tags on the machinery. Then I climbed back up to my deck, poured a second cup of coffee, and watched furious as they dug deeper into my land. But what none of us knew then, not me, not Karen, not the workers blindly following orders, was that deeper in the soil was something no one had accounted for. The high-voltage utility pole standing on the far edge of the slope wasn't just anchored in bedrock. It relied on the pressure of that soil, my soil, to remain stable. With every scoop of earth they removed, they were weakening its spine, and soon that hill would move. The next morning, I was woken by a sound I hadn't heard in years. A deep, guttural growl of machinery that seemed to shake the bones of the house. For a brief moment, still half asleep, I thought I was back overseas, hearing the rumble of tank treads in the distance or a CH-47 spooling up nearby. But when I sat up, rubbed my face, and looked out the bedroom window, the reality hit me harder than any memory. They were digging again. The backhoe had moved farther up the hill, onto my side of the property line, without a single cone or caution flag in sight. The excavation trench was now cutting a diagonal path along the slope, a fresh scar in the dry earth, and it was inching closer to the old retaining wall I'd reinforced just last fall. I threw on a jacket, grabbed my camera, and marched down the slope. The operator was halfway through another dig pass when I raised my hand and flagged him to stop. "You're trespassing," I said loud enough to compete with the engine's idle. "This is private property. Shut it down." The guy inside gave me the blank stare of someone who'd been told not to engage. He didn't shut it down. He didn't say a word. He just pulled the lever and swung the boom sideways, not toward the trench this time, but toward the base of the slope near the transformer pole. That was when I snapped. I stepped back and began filming everything. I took slow, deliberate pans of the hillside, the freshly exposed earth, the machinery, the spray-painted lines. I zoomed in on the tire tracks that were bought 10 feet inside my legal boundary, something I could prove thanks to the original plat map and a private survey I'd had done during escrow. A man in a Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association polo shirt finally approached me. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, nervous. "You can't be on site during equipment operation," he said, glancing at my camera like it was radioactive. "You're operating illegally," I shot back. There was no notification, no permit posted, and no permission granted. He cleared his throat. "The HOA has the authority to manage communal land and resolve erosion hazards." "This isn't communal land," I said, holding up my phone, with the map pulled up. "That trench is cutting through my lot. This slope is my responsibility, not the HOA's. And what you're doing right now is actionable trespass with equipment bordering on criminal." He flinched at that last word. "You'll need to talk to Ms. Jennings." "Trust me," I said, "I will." Later that day, I showed up at the HOA Community Center for the next board meeting scheduled for 6 p.m. sharp. I didn't dress up. Just jeans boots and my old army jacket, the one with the faded name patch still stitched over the chest pocket. A reminder of what I used to do when people ignored warning signs. The meeting room was already half full. Neighbors sat in folding chairs, sipping complimentary lemonade and whispering in hushed tones, while the board members, 6 of them, all seated in a neat row behind a folding table, with printed name placards, smiled and greeted each other like they were running a bake sale. At the center sat Karen Jennings. She had that look about her, not disheveled, not outright hostile, but self-righteous. She scanned the room like a queen surveying her land. When she saw me, her smile faltered for just a second. Then she straightened her shoulders and said, "Mr. Garrison, how nice to see you again." "I'm here about the illegal excavation on my slope," I said without ceremony. A few neighbors turned. Someone coughed. Karen lifted a hand. "The drainage upgrade project was approved by the board last month," she said. "The land in question is part of the shared runoff channel that borders multiple properties. You should have received a notice in your mailbox." "I didn't," I replied. "And even if I had, you don't have the legal right to dig into my lot." I have the recorded plat and survey showing exactly where the property line lies." She gave a tight smile. "We've had our own survey done." "Then you'd better hope your surveyor had a license, because if not, this entire operation is a liability nightmare." The room went quiet. Karen tapped her pen on the table. "Mr. Garrison, with all due respect, this is not a courtroom." "No," I said, pulling a printed photograph from my folder and holding it up. "But this is a photo of your contractor's backhoe, 10 feet into my property line. That's not runoff. That's mine." Someone in the audience gasped. I didn't stay for the rest of the meeting. I made my point, then walked out. The next morning, the backhoe was gone, but the damage was already done. Later that afternoon, after a light rain, I noticed something strange. The lower edge of the slope where they dug closest to the base had started to lump. Not a full collapse, not yet, but a subtle droop, like the earth was sighing under its own weight. I walked the perimeter, testing the ground with my boots, and found a soft patch near the old concrete base of the utility pole. I stood there for a long time, wind cutting through my jacket, staring at that pole. It was high voltage, one of the older metal frame types marked with faded serial numbers, and a rusted access panel. I'd studied enough field manuals to know it carried something close to 230 kilovolts, and its base was partially embedded into the sloped soil. My soil. They had dug out the earth from under one of its anchor points. I went back up to the house and called the county utilities department. After waiting through 2 transfers and explaining the situation, I was told someone would take a look in the next week. I didn't have a week. The next night, I was sitting in my kitchen when the power flickered once, twice, then died completely. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The utility pole was leaning. It hadn't collapsed, not yet, but the angle was off. 10, maybe 15 degrees off vertical. Enough that even in the moonlight I could see the line sagging, trembling like a tightrope under pressure. I backed up. My instincts kicked in, the ones trained to know when a structure was one gust away from failure. Then somewhere below me, a branch snapped. The soil gave a hiss, that awful sound of dry earth giving way, and the world held its breath. I didn't sleep that night. Every gust of wind that rattled the windows made me sit up straight in bed. Every creak of the old house sounded like steel giving way. I lay there with my boots on flashlight by the nightstand, staring at the ceiling like I was back in a tent on base during a sandstorm. Only this time the danger wasn't enemy fire, it was gravity. At dawn, I made black coffee strong enough to peel paint and walked outside to check on the pole. It had shifted another 2 inches. The slope beneath it had sunken into a slow-motion collapse. Not a landslide, not yet, but a creeping subsidence, the kind you only notice when a fence tilts or when a house starts cracking in the corners. I'd seen it before during a deployment in Turkey, where a waterlogged hill took out half a barracks in the dead of night. Back then, we blamed poor construction and bad luck. This time, I knew exactly who to blame. Karen Jennings had dug into my hillside without a permit, without engineering review, and without notifying the utility company. And now that decision, that arrogance, had destabilized a high-voltage pole supplying electricity to over 40 homes in our neighborhood. And still no one from the county had shown up. I wasn't going to wait. I spent the morning gathering evidence. I took time-stamped photos of the slope from every angle. I measured the lean of the pole using a laser level and marked the coordinates. I filmed a walkthrough video narrating what had been done, what I had witnessed, and what I had previously warned the HOA about. I emailed everything to the county utilities office, then again to the State Public Utilities Commission, CCing a lawyer friend who now worked at the Department of Energy. I didn't care if it was overkill. By noon, the slope made a soft cracking noise, like tearing cloth. I backed away. The base of the pole, a concrete footing the size of a coffin, was now clearly visible, its rebar guts peeking from the earth like broken ribs. The high-tension wires above it twitched in the wind, drawing a nervous hum through the insulators. It was going to fall. It was just a matter of when. I grabbed a traffic cone from the garage, jogged down the slope, and marked a perimeter. I wrote "Danger, unstable ground" on a cardboard sign and zip-tied it to the fence at the bottom. Then I called 911. "Are you reporting a medical emergency or active crime?" "Neither," I said. "I'm reporting an imminent infrastructure collapse involving a high-voltage power line. This is a public safety hazard." That got their attention. Two police cruisers arrived 20 minutes later. A young officer named Lynn stepped out first, followed by an older sergeant who looked like he'd been through 3 shifts in a row. I introduced myself, laid out the facts, showed them the footage, and led them down the hill. They took one look at the pole and immediately called it in. The fire department arrived, next full gear bright trucks caution tape. A battalion chief took over command of the site. By 2:00 p.m., a local news van had rolled up and utility company engineers were parking along the curb unloading gear. Yellow vests, clipboards, drones. Karen Jennings showed up 15 minutes later. She pulled up in her spotless white Mercedes SUV hair-perfect lip gloss, applied like she was arriving at a PTA fundraiser. When she saw the police tape the trucks and the crowd of neighbors gathering across the street, her expression froze. I saw her mouth something under her breath as she stormed toward the responders. She didn't even look at me. I didn't speak to her. I didn't need to. The engineers were scanning the slope, taking soil density readings, measuring the pole's shift against previous utility maps. I could tell from their expressions, tight lips, furrowed brows, that this wasn't going to be brushed off as an act of nature. I stood quietly at the edge, arms folded, watching Karen try to spin the story with the site supervisor. "It's part of a runoff improvement," she said, her voice too loud for comfort. "We had a survey done. This was all approved by the board. We were simply maintaining the area." The supervisor cut her off. "Did you notify the utility company before digging near this pole?" Karen hesitated. "It's a yes or no question, ma'am. I believed it was outside the minimum radius." "You were wrong," he said. "And now this pole is unstable and could fall into a residential zone with live lines. You're lucky this hasn't killed anyone yet." That shut her up. From where I stood, I could see neighbors murmuring to each other. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at her, and they weren't smiling. That evening, the pole was reinforced with temporary supports. Crews worked until nightfall under floodlights, bracing the base with steel pylons and emergency anchoring cables. Power was shut off to half the neighborhood for 12 hours while they rerouted the lines. Karen never came near me, but that didn't mean the fight was over. The next morning, I received a letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA, hand-delivered, no postage. The tone was icy. "Mr. Garrison, due to your recent interference in ongoing community projects and your unwarranted escalation to outside agencies, the HOA board is placing you under compliance review for obstruction of community operations. Continued interference will result in fines, penalties, and possible legal action." I laughed out loud. Obstruction. I didn't dig into anyone's property. I didn't jeopardize lives. All I did was stop a disaster they created, one that hadn't yet claimed a life, only by grace and luck. I made 10 copies of the letter, scanned and emailed it to my lawyer, and then pinned one to my corkboard under a yellow sticky note that read, "Keep everything." By the end of the week, I had a certified report from the county engineer. Conclusion: improper excavation destabilized the utility pole footing. Cause: unauthorized earthwork conducted without permit. Responsible party: Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association. Immediate action required: full soil stabilization and repair under supervision of county inspection. I printed 5 copies. The last one I taped to Karen's front door. The letter stayed on Karen's door for less than 2 hours. A neighbor told me she yanked it off, crumpled it into a tight little ball, and tossed it into her trash bin like it was a parking ticket. But that didn't change what was coming. A signature on paper couldn't hold back gravity, and a stiff wind couldn't care less about HOA politics. By Saturday afternoon, a storm system started pushing in from the west. It wasn't a big one, just one of those spring squalls that rolled over the foothills, dampening everything with light drizzle and a lazy rumble of thunder. But I knew what it meant. Wet soil meant weakened resistance. The trench line the HOA had carved out was still open. No backfill, no stabilization, no geogrid mesh, just exposed earth bleeding into the slope with every drop of rain. And now, thanks to their ignorance, the pressure that held the high-voltage pole upright had eroded further. The temporary supports added by the county crew were holding for now, but they were never meant to be permanent. I called the county inspector and left a voicemail. "You need to send someone again, tonight. This is a countdown." Then I made a decision I'd been avoiding for a week. I took the original survey map of my property, the one from the title company notarized and time-stamped, and I drove it down to the county clerk's office in person. I waited an hour in a gray hallway lined with vending machines and peeling posters about radon gas. When my number was called, I asked the records clerk to cross-reference the HOA's submitted expansion plans against my deed. She tapped on her keyboard, squinted at the monitor, and then frowned. They submitted a modified map, she said, filed under Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association Beautification Phase 2. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Modified how? She printed it. I stared at it in disbelief. They'd redrawn the property line, shifted it, pushed the eastern boundary of the so-called shared drainage corridor 30 feet west right onto my land. And they'd done it quietly using a third-party engineering firm not licensed in the county, then submitted it with a rubber-stamped board vote. No hearing, no resident notification, just buried in legalese under amenity access improvement. They forged their way into my land, then claimed it as communal. It was fraud, plain and simple. By the time I got home, the rain had picked up. Not hard, but steady. That thin mist that saturates everything. I walked the fence line with a flashlight and umbrella, checking the slope, watching the rivulets of water carve deeper grooves through the exposed dirt. Then I heard it. A creak. Not sharp, not sudden, just a long, slow groan. Metal straining. I turned my flashlight uphill and caught the glint of the utility pole. It was moving, just barely, tilting forward like a drunk waking from a long sleep. I didn't think I ran. I bolted up the hill, heart hammering soaked through in seconds, and banged on the door of the nearest neighbor, Dennis, a retired firefighter who lived one lot down. "Evacuate your backyard," I shouted. "Now! Power pole's about to come down." He didn't argue. He looked up at the slope, saw the shimmer of rain, heard the electric hum overhead, and yelled for his wife to grab the dog. I sprinted back to my property and shouted toward the next yard over. "Stay inside. Power lines." I barely made it back to the top deck when the ground shuddered. Not a quake, a shift. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard. Earth tearing away from earth. Followed by a snap, a sickening metallic scream, and then a crash that made the entire neighborhood go silent. The pole had collapsed. Not cleanly, not like a tree falling. It bent halfway down, twisted on itself, then crashed in a mess of sparks and groaning wires into the easement below. One of the support cables whipped free and slapped against a drainage culvert, throwing a shower of sparks. A transformer, somewhere down the line, blew, sending a blue flash across the wet sky. Then everything went dark. Power out. Alarms blaring, dogs barking, people yelling. Within 10 minutes, fire trucks arrived again. Police blocked the road with sawhorses and tape. The utility company came out with emergency response vehicles, and a tow truck with a mounted crane followed close behind. I stood there in the rain, soaked to the bone, watching the chaos unfold, and I wasn't surprised to see Karen Jennings marching toward the scene, HOA clipboard still in hand like it was some kind of shield. She started shouting at a utility worker, gesturing wildly, as if volume could change reality. I couldn't hear what she was saying over the storm and sirens, but I didn't need to. Her body language said it all. She was trying to deny, deflect, distract, but no one was listening to her anymore. An engineer finally walked up to me, soaking wet and exhausted looking. "You, Mr. Garrison?" "Yes." "Your report saved lives today," he said. "If that pole had hit one of the homes, we'd be dealing with something a hell of a lot worse." I nodded silent. He shook my hand and added, "The state's opening a formal investigation into the HOA's construction practices. We'll need full statements." "You'll have them," I said, "along with documentation, videos, surveys, original plats, and copies of every fake map they filed." His eyebrows went up. "You have that?" "I do." He gave a low whistle. "Then Ms. Jennings is in for one hell of a reckoning." That night, after the crews cleared out and the slope was taped off with reflective ribbon and warning signs, I sat on my back deck with a blanket and a flask. The air smelled like wet dirt and ozone. My hands still trembled, not with fear, but with righteous anger. With clarity. They could bully me. They could fine me. They could lie and forge and sneak around laws like cockroaches in the walls. But they could not outrun gravity. And they sure as hell couldn't hide from the truth forever. The next morning, Ridgeview Hills woke to silence. No birdsong, no lawnmowers, no humming air conditioners. Just the low rumble of utility trucks parked along the main road and the whir of portable generators echoing between houses. Power had yet to be restored. The high-voltage pole lay like a fallen titan across the back access road, guarded by yellow tape, and two exhausted police officers who looked like they hadn't slept. But what stirred the neighborhood most wasn't the outage. It was the HOA meeting called for 10 a.m. sharp. Emergency session, mandatory attendance. I walked down the street with a manila folder under one arm, wearing the same boots from the night before caked with dried mud. As I passed each house, I saw neighbors gathered on porches, whispering in pairs, glancing between the wrecked slope and the community center down the hill. No one spoke to me. Not yet. Inside the meeting hall, the air was thick with damp clothes, burnt coffee, and tension. The folding chairs were nearly full. At the front of the room sat the entire HOA board, all 6 members looking like deer caught in the path of an 18-wheeler. And in the middle, like always, sat Karen Jennings. She wore navy slacks, a pressed blouse, and a forced smile that looked more like a grimace. Her clipboard was replaced with a leather-bound folder. She cleared her throat as the last of the residents filed in, and then stood up with the practiced poise of a politician. "Good morning," she began, "and thank you all for being here on short notice. As many of you are aware, last night, a severe weather event caused the collapse of a utility pole near the eastern Greenbelt. Emergency crews responded promptly, and thanks to our community's preparedness and fast coordination," someone muttered from the back row. Karen hesitated. "I'm sorry," she said with a brittle laugh. "Let's maintain order, please." She went on. Something about erosion risk, unexpected saturation, and soil instability. She made it sound like a natural event, like God himself had reached down and flicked the pole over. Then she said my name. "I understand that Mr. Garrison has expressed concerns over the excavation work near his property line. I want to assure everyone that the board acted within the scope of its authority based on information provided to us at the time." That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't wave papers in the air. I simply walked to the front of the room and placed 3 items on the folding table in front of Karen. 1. My original property survey, signed and notarized. 2. The forged, modified map submitted under Phase 2 of the HOA's beautification plan. 3. A certified letter from the county engineer dated that morning concluding that unauthorized excavation caused structural destabilization of the utility pole. The room went still. "I warned you," I said, locking eyes with her. "I told you before the digging started. I sent emails. I came to the board. I asked for a pause." Karen opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. "You redrew my property line," I said, tapping the second document. "Illegally, without permits, without notifying the county. And now your decisions have nearly caused a disaster that could have killed someone." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I turned to face the neighbors. "You want to talk about preparedness? You want to talk about coordination? Let's talk about the fact that I had to call 911 because the people in charge of this neighborhood were too proud to admit they'd made a mistake." Karen stood now, voice tight. "Mr. Garrison, while I understand your frustration, this is not the appropriate forum for accusations." I stepped aside and let the board see the photographs, the slope before, during, and after the trenching. The footage of the backhoe. The video of the leaning pole time-stamped 1 hour before it fell. "I'm not accusing," I said. "I'm presenting facts." At that point, something unexpected happened. Dennis, the retired firefighter from next door, stood up. He cleared his throat. "I live next to Garrison. If he hadn't knocked on my door last night, my wife and I would have been out back with the dog when that pole came down." Another voice chimed in. "He told us to stay inside. We thought he was overreacting, until the lights went out." A third. "I saw the backhoe on his slope. I thought it was weird but figured the HOA had it covered." Karen's mask began to crack. I was advised by a licensed engineering consultant," she stammered. "Who?" someone asked. Summit Terrain Solutions," she replied too quickly. I recognized the name. I'd already looked them up. "Summit lost their license in this state 3 years ago," I said calmly. "They can't legally file site evaluations or sign off on grading plans." Gasps. One of the board members leaned forward, whispering something to the man beside her. He paled. Karen's jaw clenched. "We acted in good faith. You forged a map." "That was a correction to a mapping error. It was fraud," I said flatly. "And I have the evidence to prove it. The county is opening a formal review of HOA operations. You'll be hearing from the state attorney's office next." The room erupted. People talking over each other. Questions flying. Who approved the map? Where did the money go? Why didn't the residents get a vote? Karen backed away from the table. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked small. Not just shaken, but cornered. By the time the meeting ended, 3 board members had resigned on the spot. Karen stormed out, flanked by 2 remaining loyalists, and refused to speak to the press waiting outside. The local paper ran a front-page story the next day. After utility pole collapse, residents demand accountability. And just like that, the tide began to turn. Neighbors who'd never spoken to me before started dropping by. One brought cookies. Another brought a typed letter of apology. Dennis and his wife invited me over for dinner. Funny how fast people remember your name when you've saved their life from a falling transformer. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Because if Karen thought losing her grip on the neighborhood was bad, she hadn't seen what was coming next. The following Monday, while Ridgeview Hills still ran on partial generator power and the HOA's office remained conveniently under maintenance, I made my way to City Hall. Not with a protest sign or a lawyer, not yet, but with something far heavier in my grip: the past. Inside a long cardboard tube wrapped in archival paper and sealed with yellowing tape was the original blueprint of my property and the surrounding slope. Not the simplified version in the title packet. Not the county's generic plot map. The real one drawn by hand in 1982, when this entire section of Ridgeview Hills was still ranch land. My father-in-law had once worked as a civil surveyor, and before he passed, he gave me access to a trove of documents he'd archived from developments across the county. Coincidentally, this hill, my hill, had been one of his final jobs before retirement. When I bought the property, years later, I remembered the name and dug up the records. Never thought I'd need them, until now. At the Public Works counter, I presented the tube like it was sacred. The clerk, a tired-looking man in his 60s with bifocals and a wedding ring too tight for his hand, looked up at me curiously. "I need these compared against all HOA filings for beautification phase 2, I said. "There's a fraudulent modification I want on the record." He blinked. Fraudulent. I unrolled the top layer of the blueprint right there on the counter. The details were precise. Contour lines, soil composition, footing placements, electrical anchoring zones. Every inch of the eastern slope detailed in measured ink. And right in the middle of it, in unmistakable red pencil. Private retaining zone. Non-negotiable access. Must not be disturbed. The clerk studied it. "This looks official." It is. Original engineer's signature is on the bottom right. He was state certified until 1993. That's a legal survey. He whistled, and the HOA submitted something different. I pulled out the Phase 2 documents Karen had filed, complete with a doctored map that nudged my boundary line 30 feet west and erased all mention of utility footings. It looked like it had been created on someone's laptop in an afternoon. No soil data, no signature, no licensing stamp. Just a typed note that read, "Updated parcel realignment per community development." The clerk stared at both documents, then at me. "You know this is going to get loud, right?" "I'm counting on it." By noon, a formal challenge was on file. By Wednesday, city inspectors were walking the slope with copies of my blueprint in hand, comparing it to aerial photos and site measurements. One of them, a tall woman with a badge clipped to her vest and a neon survey marker in her hand, turned to me and said, "Mr. Garrison, this whole excavation was built on bad data. This kind of misrepresentation is going to trigger a full audit." Exactly what I wanted. Because Karen hadn't just trespassed. She'd constructed an entire narrative, permits maps, community letters around a lie. And now that lie was unraveling. But then another twist arrived, one that almost made me laugh. That Thursday, I received an official notice from the Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association, signed not by Karen, but by one of the remaining board members. "Mr. Garrison, due to the ongoing review of Phase 2 development and recent safety concerns, the HOA hereby requests that you cease all external communications regarding the project until the investigation concludes. This includes contact with media outlets, city departments, and legal representatives. Violation may result in legal proceedings." They were trying to gag me. I pinned the letter to my garage wall with a screwdriver and sent a photo of it to 3 people. My lawyer, Justine Torres, a bulldog of a woman who once took down an entire HOA in Palm Springs over a wrongly felled palm tree. A journalist named Marcy Kent from the local news station who'd interviewed me the night the pole came down. And finally, my nephew, who worked as a legislative assistant in the state assembly. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee when my phone rang. It was Marcy. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "We just got confirmation from the Public Works Director. He's opening a formal inquiry into Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association's zoning amendments. And I just got approval to run a full feature on the collapse from your perspective. You're serious. I'm calling it The Man Who Stopped the Fall. You okay being on camera again?" I let out a breath. I think it's time. That weekend, they aired the story. They showed footage of the leaning pole interviews with engineers, the original blueprints, and even a brief shot of Karen turning her back on reporters outside her home. They played my audio from the night of the collapse, my warning to neighbors, my call to emergency services. They painted me not as a disgruntled homeowner, but as a whistleblower, a protector. By Sunday night, the Ridgeview Hills Facebook group exploded. Dozens of posts, screenshots, resident complaints going back years, fines for incorrect mailbox colors, threats of lien over flower boxes, photos of Karen at HOA meetings berating elderly residents over hedge heights, and then a bombshell post from a former board member. Well, I resigned because I refused to sign the Phase 2 documents. Karen pushed them through anyway, claiming it was urgent. I regret not speaking up sooner. Everything Garrison said is true. The comment had over 400 likes by morning. It was no longer just about my slope or the power pole. It was about everything Karen had built and how easily it was falling apart. I didn't celebrate, not yet, because I knew what wounded animals did when cornered. And sure enough, just 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived at my door. Inside a formal threat of lawsuit. Yes, defamation, interference with HOA governance, disruption of community harmony. Signed by Karen Jennings herself. She was trying to sue me into silence. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that I had one more move. One final document. One she'd never seen. One I had been saving for the right moment. Tucked in my safe, sealed in plastic, was a restrictive covenant, filed in 1983, and it had Karen's name written all over it. The envelope sat unopened on my kitchen table for almost an hour, while I paced the living room in silence. Outside, the storm had passed, but the air was thick with tension. I finally peeled the flap back and read it in full. Karen Jennings, acting as president of the Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association, was filing a civil suit against me. For what? Defamation, obstruction of HOA operations, malicious incitement of public unrest. The kind of legalese you throw at a wall when you're desperate to make something stick. I poured a second cup of coffee and reread it, not because I was worried, but because it was proof she was losing control. So I made a copy. Then I called Justine Torres. She didn't even let me finish reading the letter before cutting in. "This is garbage," she said. "Posturing. They have no grounds. Let her file. I'll counter so hard she'll have to rent out her second floor just to pay legal fees." I chuckled. "You sure?" Retired colonel with evidence, documents, witness statements, city maps, and a certified engineering report versus one HOA president with a fake plat line and a broken power pole. This isn't just a defense, Alan. It's a slam dunk. It was the first time I'd heard her sound excited. Later that afternoon, the city engineers returned to the Hill. But this time, they weren't just from the local utilities office. These were state-level structural engineers, geotechnical experts, and risk assessment specialists. They wore helmets with clipped badges, carried laser scanners and soil probes, and walked the slope with measured, deliberate care. I stood at the top of the ridge, with one of them, a woman named Dr. Helena Reed. She was in her 40s, calm-eyed with a soft but precise way of speaking. She'd been called in from Sacramento. This trench, she said, crouching beside the excavation line the HOA had ordered, was dug without lateral support. No shoring. No proper backfill. Whoever designed this didn't understand hillside mechanics. Or didn't care, I said. She nodded. "You see here, they cut through the capillary break. That's what accelerated the seepage after the storm. Your original wall was doing its job. They compromised it. And the pole," she turned to the collapsed base now covered in safety netting. "The pole failed because of two things: soil undermining and the loss of lateral resistance. It was stable until someone took away the earth that held it. She took a breath. You weren't being dramatic. You were right. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. At the bottom of the hill, Karen appeared. Again. But this time, she didn't have a clipboard or her pearls. She was wearing a long beige raincoat and holding a leather handbag. And she wasn't alone. 2 men in gray suits followed her. One of them was her lawyer, a real estate litigator named Paul Lieberman, known locally for being aggressive, flashy, and mostly unsuccessful. The other looked like a publicist. Karen made a beeline toward me, while the engineers spread out across the slope. Mr. Garrison, she called, voice saccharine but tight. I raised an eyebrow. Karen. She gave a brittle smile. We'd like to resolve this amicably. I couldn't help myself. I laughed. Is that what you call a lawsuit now? That letter was precautionary, her lawyer cut in. To prevent further escalation. Dr. Reed joined me on the slope, then brushing off her hands. If you're looking for legal clarity, I can provide it. Based on what we've seen, the HOA's actions meet the criteria for civil negligence and possibly criminal endangerment. Karen turned pale. The lawyer blinked. I'm sorry, what? Dr. Reed was unfazed. The excavation violated 3 state codes. And the forged plat line, that's under review. If it was knowingly submitted to misrepresent boundaries, it could constitute fraud. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. I leaned slightly toward her. You should probably sit down. But she didn't. She turned and walked away stiff as a mannequin, her high-end boots squelching in the damp grass. That night, the city issued a full construction moratorium on all Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association projects pending investigation. The following morning, the county assessor's office posted a notice on the HOA clubhouse. Under audit. Do not remove. It was official now. The paper trail, the permits, the engineering reports, the blueprints, the testimonies, all of it was coming to light. And I hadn't even used my last card. Not yet. I went into the garage that evening and opened the small fireproof safe I'd kept locked since the day I moved in. Inside, under old military commendations and a folder labeled Final Will, was a slim plastic sheath containing a document so old the ink had faded into sepia. Restrictive Covenant Agreement. Parcel 17D East Ridgeview Slope. Filed June 1983. Filed by Ridgeview Development Group. Witnessed by Henry Ellison, City Planning Commissioner. Deceased Clause 7. No modification to grade drainage anchoring or structural terrain shall occur on Parcel 17D without the signed consent of the property owner, municipal engineer, and state utility representative. 3 required signatures, none of which Karen had. And here's the kicker, the owner. In 1983, was not Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association. It was a private individual, a woman named Deborah Kincaid, who sold the parcel years later to a young couple, who later sold it to me. The HOA never owned the slope, ever, not even for a day. They had fabricated ownership in every filing since the beautification project began. That meant the entire basis of their expansion, the trails, the fences, the trenching, the digging had been conducted on illegally claimed land. The next day, I delivered the covenant to the city attorney's office, by hand. When the clerk scanned it in, she paused and said, "This changes things." She looked up at me with a smile. "You're not just right. You're bulletproof." I walked out into the sunlight, the weight of years sliding off my shoulders. Karen had built a house of cards, and I had just pulled out the foundation. The city council chamber wasn't exactly a courtroom, but it felt like one that morning. Rows of wooden benches filled with concerned residents, local journalists, and even a few city officials who usually avoided HOA business like the plague. The overhead lights were harsh, the flag in the corner limp, and the murmurs from the crowd buzzed like static under the low hum of the HVS. Karen sat at the front of the chamber, her posture rigid. She wore a muted navy pantsuit, her hair pulled tightly back, makeup done just enough to look composed. But I could see the micro-expressions, the tension in her jaw, the tapping of her foot, the tight grip she kept on her legal pad. Her lawyer sat beside her, occasionally leaning in to whisper something, and each time she responded with a quick nod, as if trying to convince herself this wasn't spiraling out of control. I sat on the opposite side of the room, dressed simply jeans, clean boots, and my Army service jacket. I didn't bring a lawyer. I brought documents, evidence, truth, and I brought calm. The city attorney opened the proceedings. This hearing is to review public complaints, property violations, and alleged misconduct by the Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association, specifically concerning unauthorized excavation, misrepresentation of property boundaries, and endangerment of public safety. Then he looked up. "Mr. Allen Garrison, you may proceed." I stood slowly, my knees stiff from the cold, and walked to the podium. A screen behind me flickered on, showing satellite images of the slope before and after the excavation. I spoke clearly, letting each word carry. "This is my land," I began. "I purchased it 5 years ago, with a clear title, certified survey, and the full understanding that my eastern slope was private. For years, I maintained it, reinforced it, and ensured it posed no threat to anyone. I didn't ask for HOA assistance. I didn't need oversight. I simply asked to be left alone." A click. The image changed to video footage from my phone, showing the backhoe tearing through the soil. This is what the HOA did. Without warning, without permits, without a single word of notice. Another click. The footage of the leaning pole filled the screen. "And this," I said, letting the silence do the work, "was the result. No one moved. Even Karen didn't blink. The pole could have killed someone," I continued, "and the board tried to blame me for it. I was fined, threatened, and eventually sued. But here's the truth." I held up a clear plastic sleeve. Inside was the restrictive covenant from 1983. This document proves that Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association never had legal control over the slope. Every improvement, every project, every dollar spent on beautification phase 2 was based on a false claim of ownership. I laid it on the table in front of the council. Moreover, the association filed a modified plat line with the county using a third-party surveyor who was not licensed in the state. That's not just procedural negligence. That's fraud. The city attorney stood. "Mr. Garrison, thank you." I nodded and returned to my seat. Karen's lawyer stood quickly, trying to regain control. "We dispute Mr. Garrison's interpretation of the covenant and maintain that the HOA acted in the best interest of the community." A council member interrupted. "Did you verify ownership of the slope before initiating excavation?" There was a pause. The lawyer shifted. "We acted on documents that were in the HOA archives, presumed to be accurate. But they weren't," the council member replied. "And you filed altered documents. That's a serious accusation with serious consequences." Karen's face flushed red. Then a neighbor, Mrs. Abady, a quiet woman in her 70s, who usually kept to herself, stood from the back of the chamber. "I have something to say," she said softly. The council granted her permission, and she approached the microphone. "I've lived in Ridgeview Hills for 32 years. I was here when they built the first walking paths. When Karen moved in, she promised to beautify our community, and at first, we believed her. But then the fines started coming. Warnings for bird feeders, threats over paint colors, and when I spoke up about my concerns, I got a letter threatening a lien." She looked over at Karen. "You made people afraid in their own homes." Gasps echoed across the room. Another neighbor rose, then another, and another. One by one, residents came forward with stories: false fines, retaliatory inspections, ignored complaints, forged maintenance logs, hidden meeting minutes. By the time the 10th speaker sat down, Karen was visibly shaking. Then the council delivered its verdict. Effective immediately, the Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association is hereby placed under investigation for administrative misconduct. All current projects are suspended. All board members are temporarily removed from office pending review. Ms. Karen Jennings is barred from any administrative activity within the HOA during the investigation. The gavel dropped with a hard crack. Karen didn't move. Her lawyer whispered something, but she didn't react. It was as if the weight of the room had finally crushed her. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply exhaled and closed my folder. On the way out, Dennis caught up with me. "You did it," he said. "No," I replied. "The truth did." The crowd thinned, neighbors patting me on the back, murmuring thanks. I was exhausted, but not just physically. It was like the fight had finally been let out of my bones. But the story wasn't over. 2 days later, I received a letter not from Karen, but from the county office. A formal request to join a special committee, a task force of homeowners, engineers, and city officials tasked with reevaluating HOA powers and community oversight across the county. They wanted me to help rewrite the system, not just for Ridgeview Hills, but for everyone like me. The morning after the hearing, Ridgeview Hills felt different. It wasn't louder or quieter, it was lighter. Like a dense fog had been burned off by the sun, revealing what had always been there beneath it, a community tired of walking on eggshells. A neighborhood ready to speak. For the first time since I moved in, people waved to me without hesitation. Some even crossed the street to shake my hand. I saw potted plants reappear on porches that had been bare for years. An American flag once ordered taken down by Karen for being visually disruptive now flew proudly from my neighbor's deck. No one seemed afraid anymore. And Karen, gone. Not in a literal sense. Her Mercedes still sat in the driveway, pristine as ever. But the woman herself had vanished. No clipboard strolls, no front yard lectures. Curtains drawn tight. HOA signs removed from her lawn. Even her dog, a yappy little thing named Cricket, wasn't barking at the gate like usual. Later that week, a formal letter was mailed to every resident in Ridgeview Hills. Effective immediately, Karen Jennings has resigned from the Ridgeview Lakeside Community Association Board. A new election will be held under the supervision of the city. The Phase 2 beautification project is permanently suspended. All pending fines and citations issued during the Phase 2 period are nullified. I sat on my porch and read it twice just to let it settle. Then I looked at the hill. The slope was still wounded. Deep gouges from the excavation remained. The old retaining wall slightly tilted the path of the collapsed pole, now overgrown with emergency netting and soil stabilization mesh. It would take time, money, work. But it would heal. So would we. In the weeks that followed, I became something I never expected: a point of contact. People came to me not just to say thanks, but to ask real questions about their rights, about their deeds, about how to read a plat map or dispute a citation. I helped where I could. I directed them to lawyers when needed. And quietly, I started scanning every document I could find from the HOA's archive, building a digital library just in case. The biggest change came when the city invited me to a closed session meeting about HOA reform. Inside a low-ceilinged conference room with water-stained ceiling tiles and plastic chairs, I sat beside city officials, engineers, and a few other homeowners from across the county, each with their own story. A veteran in his 70s who'd been fined for installing a wheelchair ramp. A single mother harassed for having a child's toy visible on her porch. A teacher who was sued by her HOA for planting wildflowers. The stories poured out like poison being drawn from an old wound. We spent hours reviewing statutes, enforcement protocols, and the lack of oversight that allowed associations to weaponize power against the very people they were supposed to protect. It was exhausting, but it felt necessary. We weren't just fighting one HOA anymore. We were redesigning the system. Back in Ridgeview Hills, the election for a new board was underway. For the first time, residents actually cared. There were meet and greets, flyers taped to mailboxes, even a town hall at the library where candidates answered real questions. I didn't run. People asked me to. I even had neighbors drop off baked goods and handwritten notes begging me to consider it, but I said no. I'd done my part. What I did offer was to moderate the candidate debate. Fair, neutral, transparent. The turnout was larger than expected. Dennis, the retired firefighter, ended up winning the vote by a landslide. The first thing he did, he reinstated a community oversight committee. Then he proposed term limits. Then he rewrote the fine policy with legal review. The ripple effect had begun. Karen's lawsuit, withdrawn. Her lawyer sent a terse letter to my attorney stating a reevaluation of priorities and ongoing family matters as the reason. We both knew it meant she'd lost. Her reputation, her power, her ability to intimidate behind closed doors gone. But the greatest moment came not from courts or council chambers. It came one quiet evening weeks later as I stood at the edge of my property looking over the repaired slope. Fresh soil, native plants, proper drainage now designed by real engineers and approved by the state. It was no longer just a hill. It was a reminder. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, came walking down the street with his father. They stopped at the corner where a new wooden bench had been installed near the slope. "Is this where it happened?" the boy asked. His dad nodded. "That's the place." I caught his eye and gave a small wave. The man smiled back and said, "Thank you." I nodded, just once. That night, I went back inside, poured myself a small glass of whiskey, and pulled out a photo from the drawer. My wife, long past, smiling in front of this same house years ago. I placed it on the mantel and sat for a long while thinking not about the fight, but about the peace that follows it. I wasn't just defending land, I was defending dignity. And I was finally home. It took almost a full season before the grass on the slope grew back. The city had sent a restoration team in early May, just as the rain tapered off. And by July, the hill was covered in green again. Not just grass, but creeping ground cover, native wildflowers, and stone paths carefully contoured to the hillside's shape. It looked nothing like the wound Karen left behind. It looked intentional, cared for, strong. So was I. For a long time, I had thought retirement meant withdrawing. That after years of service and loss, especially after my wife passed, the only thing left for me to do was stay out of the way. To quietly live out the rest of my life on a patch of land where I could sit still, keep my head down, and finally let the world spin without me. But that's not how it works, is it? Some people like Karen think power comes from titles, from rules printed on glossy paper and voted on in secret. They think a clipboard or a fine is enough to scare a person into submission. And for a while, they might be right. People go along, stay quiet, hope it blows over. Until it doesn't. Until someone says, enough. That morning, the one when I stood before the city council with nothing but blueprints, a weathered covenant, and a voice I thought I'd long since buried, that was the day I stopped hiding behind my fence line. I didn't just reclaim my land. I reclaimed my ground. Neighbors still come by sometimes to ask questions. The new board has been proactive, transparent, organized, even kind. They put up a sign at the trailhead near the slope, in memory of what was almost lost and what was bravely protected. They didn't name me, but people knew, and that was enough. The city followed through on its promise. The task force expanded statewide. A new bill passed requiring third-party auditing of HOA developments involving structural changes. My name was listed in the appendix as a primary civilian contributor, but I wasn't chasing recognition. I was chasing peace, and slowly it returned. The sound of birds came back to the hillside. The deer wandered lower than they used to. On some mornings, I saw a fox dart between the sagebrush, nosing through the new wildflowers. Life, it turns out, is pretty resilient when left to heal. One evening near sunset, I walked down to the bench by the bottom of the hill, the same spot where the utility pole once stood before it crashed and shook this town awake. I sat for a while, listening to the breeze rattle through the leaves. That's when I saw her. Karen. She was walking alone, far across the street, clutching a grocery bag with both arms. She didn't look like herself, no more immaculate hair, no pencil skirt, no pearls. Just a plain gray sweater, sneakers, and eyes that never lifted from the pavement. She didn't look up at me. I didn't wave. I didn't need to. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a headline. Sometimes it doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply removes the power from those who abused it and returns it quietly to the hands of the people they tried to silence. Later that week, I received a handwritten letter in my mailbox. No name, no return address, just a few lines in looping cursive. You reminded us we're not helpless. Thank you for standing up when we didn't know how. You changed everything. I folded the note and tucked it into the back of my field journal between a photo of the hill from 2 years ago and the blueprint that started it all. That weekend, I invited Dennis and his wife over for barbecue. They brought peach cobbler. We ate on the patio just above the slope, watching the lights come on slowly across the valley. Peaceful, simple. Exactly what I'd always hoped this place could be. Before they left, Dennis stood and looked out over the hill. He nodded slowly. You know, he said this town's going to tell your story for a long time. I smiled. Let them. Because in the end, it wasn't about me. It wasn't even about Karen. It was about the principle that a person's home, their land, their dignity, their voice isn't something a committee can take with a vote or a forged document. It's something earned. And once you've stood your ground and reclaimed it truly, reclaimed, there's no HOA on earth that can ever take it from you again. I looked out over the ridge, the sun dipping low, the air golden with quiet. And I knew in the deepest part of me, I had finally come home.